The year was 1945. The world was changing, its cities scarred by fire and war, its nations reshaped by surrender and victory. From the ruins of the Pacific conflict, ships cut across the ocean, carrying passengers who had never imagined setting foot on enemy soil. They were Japanese women prisoners of war, nurses, clerks, and civilians caught in the machinery of empire, brought across vast waters under American watch. Their faces carried both fear and exhaustion, their minds filled with uncertainty. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted the United States as a land of greed, chaos, and brutality. The women expected harshness, cruelty, and a life stripped of dignity. Yet as the ships approached the American coastline, a different sight emerged. Rising skylines gleamed against the sun. Organized ports bustled with machines unlike anything they had seen back home. The sheer size, the order, and the power of this foreign land were overwhelming. It was not the savage wasteland they had been told to expect. It was a nation alive with industry, confidence, and modernity. As the women disembarked, guarded yet unbroken, their eyes widened at every detail. Paved roads stretching endlessly, automobiles lined neatly, uniformed officers standing with a discipline that did not translate into open cruelty. Shock, disbelief, and an uneasy sense of respect began to replace fear. What awaited them on this new soil would challenge every assumption they had carried across the ocean. Under the pale sky of an early American morning, the ships slid into harbor, steel hulls gliding against the rhythm of the water as if even the ocean understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The Japanese women, prisoners of war carried across a vast expanse of sea, clutched their meager belongings with trembling hands. They had endured weeks of uncertainty at sea, haunted by rumors of cruelty and endless punishments that awaited them once they reached their destination. From the moment they were told they would be transferred to the United States itself, the whispers had grown more chilling. For years, they had been taught that America was a brutal place, home to people who lacked refinement, honor, or humanity. To step onto American soil, they believed, was to fall into the hands of the enemy at his strongest, to witness firsthand the destruction of their dignity. Yet as the ship creaked toward the docks, a silence fell over the women. Ahead of them rose not a wasteland of savages, but a living monument of steel, glass, and motion. The skyline loomed, tall buildings shimmering in the sun, their windows reflecting light across the harbor. The docks bristled with cranes, massive mechanical arms that swung gracefully, lifting crates with a precision almost terrifying in its efficiency. Trucks and jeeps stood in long rows, gleaming beneath the morning light, while rail cars clanked and hissed nearby, iron horses waiting to be filled. The sheer scale of it all dwarfed anything the women had known back home. Japan had ports, yes, but here was something different, a scale of wealth and technology that revealed itself not in boasts or slogans, but in the quiet, overwhelming presence of machinery working in perfect harmony. The guards, American soldiers in crisp uniforms, moved with an ease that unsettled the women. They were disciplined, sharp-eyed, and firm in their commands, yet there was no unbridled cruelty in their movements. They did not lash out unnecessarily, did not sneer as the women expected. Instead, they guided them down the gangplank with calm gestures, ensuring no one stumbled or fell. This confused the prisoners more than any act of aggression might have. Fear they could understand. Kindness, even in small measures, disarmed them. They had been told Americans were animals, yet here they were, behaving with order, with confidence, with something that felt dangerously close to humanity. The women's first steps on American soil were hesitant, almost reverent, as though they feared the ground itself might reject them. Beneath their sandals and worn shoes, the pavement was smooth, even, and wide. The road stretched further than their eyes could follow, lined with automobiles of every shape and size. Engines rumbled, tires rolled, and civilians bustled about in the distance, busy with lives untouched by war's destruction. It was a jarring sight for those who had come from bombed cities, ration lines, and constant scarcity. Here the war felt distant. Here life seemed to move forward with a momentum Japan had long since lost. One woman, her eyes fixed on a towering crane that groaned and lifted an entire container with effortless grace, whispered to another, "How can they do this so easily?" It was a question born not of curiosity alone, but of disbelief. Back home, resources were scarce, machinery often old or fragile, and labor was backbreaking. Yet here, machines did the work of 100 men, and they did it tirelessly, endlessly. Each turn of the crane's arm, each roar of an engine seemed to remind the prisoners that they were witnessing not just a nation that had won a war, but a nation that had mastered the art of progress. The air itself carried a weight they had not expected. It smelled of oil, of industry, of burning fuel and salt water. The sounds of horns, engines and voices layered over one another until it became a symphony of modern life. For women raised in cities shaped by tradition, narrow streets and limited resources, the sensory overload was staggering. Some turned their faces away, unwilling to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing their awe. Others, despite themselves, could not help but stare, their eyes wide as if drinking in every detail, as though they might never again see such a display of organized power. The soldiers guided them into formation, lining them along the docks where trucks idled, ready to take them deeper inland. The women glanced at the vehicles, so many, all perfectly maintained, their metal frames shining in the light. The engines growled with restrained energy, promising both mobility and dominance. These machines symbolized something greater than transportation. They embodied a nation that had resources to spare, fuel to burn, and the ability to move people and goods across vast distances without faltering. For a people who had struggled with shortages, whose military had often marched on worn feet instead of riding in trucks, the symbolism was unavoidable. Even the uniforms of the American soldiers told a story. The fabric was clean, sturdy, and abundant, unlike the patched and faded clothing many Japanese soldiers had worn during the final desperate years of the war. The rifles slung across their shoulders gleamed with oil, maintained with a care that suggested endless supplies. Nothing here seemed scarce. Nothing suggested desperation. For the Japanese women, it was as though they had stepped into a world operating under entirely different laws, a world where abundance was natural and progress inevitable. As the trucks finally roared to life, carrying the women away from the port, they glanced back at the ocean they had crossed. Behind them was the war-torn empire of their homeland, its cities reduced to ash and rubble. Ahead of them was a nation that had not only survived, but thrived, seemingly untouched by the chaos that had consumed so much of the world. In that moment, the women felt the first pangs of an unsettling realization. Japan had fought a war against not just a military force, but against an entire system of progress that had been decades ahead. The journey inland only deepened this realization. The highways stretched endlessly, smooth and wide, cutting through landscapes that seemed carefully ordered, cultivated, and alive with motion. Cars zipped by in both directions, their polished bodies flashing in the light, while roadside towns passed in a blur, each alive with businesses, signs, and activity. There were no ruins, no burned-out shells of buildings, no evidence of scarcity or collapse. America appeared whole, thriving and untouchable. The women sat in silence, overwhelmed by the contrast, their minds filled with questions they dared not speak aloud. It was captivity, yes, but it was also revelation. With every mile, the image of America that had been painted for them back home cracked and shattered. The supposed barbarism of their captors gave way to something far more dangerous, a power built not just on weapons, but on the ability to create, to organize, to expand without faltering. The shock was not in the harshness of their treatment, but in the realization that everything they had been told had been a lie. The barracks stood in rows like quiet sentinels, each one freshly painted, each corner squared and precise, as though they had been arranged with a level of care the women did not expect to be granted. When they had first heard they were bound for prisoner camps in America, dread had gripped their stomachs. The word camp in their minds conjured images of starvation, filth, and endless humiliation. They braced themselves for wooden shacks barely standing, for mud floors and cold drafts seeping through cracks in the walls. Yet as they were escorted through the gates, their eyes widened. The American camps, though ringed with barbed wire and patrolled by guards, were not the crude cages they had imagined. Instead, they were orderly, functional, and surprisingly clean. Each barrack had windows that let in shafts of sunlight. Beds, though simple, were arranged neatly in rows, each with a mattress and blankets that did not carry the stench of decay, but smelled faintly of soap. The women exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the cruelty they had braced for. They had been conditioned to believe captivity meant a stripping of all dignity. Yet here they were, given a place to sleep that was sturdier and more comfortable than the shelters many of them had endured in war-torn Japan. The silence of that realization hung heavy, unspoken but shared among them. It was the kitchens that startled them most. They were led into a large hall where lines of steaming trays stretched across counters. The air was filled with the smell of bread, soup, and meat, aromas so rich and unfamiliar after years of scarcity that some of the women felt dizzy. Soldiers behind the counters handed out portions with mechanical efficiency, their expressions neutral but not cruel. The prisoners accepted the trays with hands that trembled slightly, unable to believe the abundance before them. Rice was rare, meat rarer still, yet here it was, offered to them even in captivity. The taste, when it reached their lips, was overwhelming, not only in flavor but in what it represented, that America had enough to feed even its enemies with generosity. The medical tents stood nearby, clean white structures with red crosses painted boldly across their roofs. Inside, cots were arranged in tidy lines and shelves overflowed with supplies. Bandages, medicines, and instruments gleamed under electric lamps. Women who had fallen ill during the journey or bore untreated wounds were guided inside and examined by American nurses with brisk efficiency. There was no unnecessary cruelty, no neglect. The treatments were direct, practical, and effective. The Japanese women could not reconcile this with the stories they had heard of Americans as heartless and barbaric. The contradiction gnawed at them, forcing them into silence. Every detail of camp life carried with it a subtle shock. Water flowed from taps with a steady stream, cold or heated depending on the pipe. Showers stood ready for use, allowing the women to wash away the grime of their journey. The toilets, though communal, were far more advanced than what many had known in rural Japan. Even the smallest objects, the polished steel utensils in the mess hall, the sturdy construction of the tables, the clocks ticking on the walls, were reminders that America existed in a realm of progress their homeland had not yet reached. But there was discipline, too. The guards made it clear that order would be maintained. Roll calls were taken with precision. The women lined in rows as names were checked. Curfews were enforced, and the boundaries of the camp were never to be crossed. Yet the enforcement of rules lacked the gratuitous cruelty they expected. The guards barked orders, yes, but blows and insults were rare. Punishments, when delivered, were controlled and systematic rather than wild or vindictive. It was as though even discipline here was guided not by rage, but by structure. This was perhaps the most disorienting revelation. Captivity was meant to break them. Yet in this place, it carried an unsettling undercurrent of stability. For women who had lived through shortages, bombings, and the collapse of infrastructure back home, there was an almost perverse relief in the order of the camp. Meals came on time. Medical care was available. Work assignments were organized and clearly defined. Even their suffering had been reduced to a schedule. It was not freedom, but it was a kind of security they had not felt in years. In the evenings, when the day's routines had ended, the women would sit together outside the barracks and watch the lamps flicker on across the camp. Electric light, humming softly against the dark, bathed the compound in a glow that pushed away shadows. For many of them, electricity had been sporadic during the war, often lost during bombings or restricted by rationing. Yet here in captivity, the lights burned steadily. It was as though the camp itself was a microcosm of America's unshakable abundance. A small window into the resources and organization that had carried the nation to victory. Some of the women resisted the pull of admiration, clinging to the belief that their captors were still the enemy. But others, silently and reluctantly, could not help but acknowledge what they saw. The Americans had not only defeated their nation on the battlefield, they had revealed a way of life, a standard of organization that made defeat inevitable. Every tray of food, every working light bulb, every neatly folded blanket whispered a truth they could not avoid. America had power, not simply because of its weapons, but because it could sustain, feed, and maintain order on a scale Japan could not match. Day by day, as the Japanese women adjusted to life within the American camps, the initial shock of their arrival began to transform into something deeper. What had first been disbelief now became a constant process of comparison. Every sound, every sight, every small piece of technology seemed to mock the stories they had been told back home. Propaganda had painted America as a land of chaos and moral decay, but here they were, surrounded by an order and abundance so vast it could not be denied. Their illusions, once woven tightly around their hearts, unraveled strand by strand with each passing day. The highways beyond the camp gates were visible from certain vantage points, long stretches of asphalt cutting across the horizon. The women often found themselves staring at them during work details or moments of rest. Cars streamed endlessly in both directions, sleek, polished automobiles that seemed to glide rather than stumble. Trucks roared past, carrying goods with a speed and efficiency that left them speechless. Back in Japan, fuel had become scarce long before the war's end, and bicycles or worn wooden carts were often the only means of transport left for ordinary people. But here in this foreign land, cars were not luxuries. They were everywhere, symbols of a nation's prosperity. Each honking horn, each flash of headlights was another reminder that the United States was not struggling to survive. It was thriving. Inside the camp, the electric lamps burned each evening without interruption. At first, the women could not understand how the lights never flickered, never went dark. In Tokyo and other cities, power had been rationed, entire neighborhoods left in darkness when bombs fell or supplies ran thin. Here, even in a camp built for prisoners, electricity flowed like a natural resource. Light bulbs glowed steadily over mess halls, over the barracks, over the medical tents. Radios crackled in the guard towers, playing music or relaying messages, their mechanical voices a constant reminder of a technological world that seemed decades ahead of what the women had known. Perhaps most jarring were the smaller machines, the ones that did not dominate the landscape like trucks or cranes, but still carried the weight of progress. Typewriters clicked under the hands of clerks, producing neat rows of letters faster than any brush or pen could manage. Filing cabinets stood tall, filled with records and documents, their drawers sliding in and out with smooth efficiency. To the women, even these small details spoke volumes. They realized that the war had been fought not just with rifles and planes, but with an entire system of organization powered by such tools. America's strength lay in its ability to harness technology not only for destruction, but for order, record-keeping, and communication. The contrast was so great that it created a kind of internal war within the women themselves. On one hand, they remained loyal to their homeland, mourning its destruction and carrying pride for the sacrifices their people had endured. On the other hand, they could not deny what they saw each day. The United States existed in another world of advancement. The war had been lost, not simply because of strategy or battlefield defeats, but because Japan could not match this scale of progress. It was like watching two civilizations on different timelines, one surging forward while the other was left struggling in the past. There were nights when the women would gather in silence, gazing at the American flag that fluttered above the camp. Its colors, red, white, and blue, stood vivid against the evening sky, illuminated by spotlights that never failed to shine. They would sit together, whispering in hushed tones about what they had witnessed that day. Some spoke of the endless food supplies, others of the steady hum of machines, others still of the strange calm in the faces of the guards. Each woman wrestled with her own emotions, anger, awe, sorrow, and resignation. The flag, once an emblem of the enemy, now symbolized something larger, something terrifying in its inevitability. It represented not only military victory, but a civilization that seemed to have secured the future itself. Even the youngest among them began to understand this unspoken truth. They noticed how American children outside the camps, glimpsed through wire fences or during supervised movements, played freely with toys and wore clothing untouched by rationing. It was as if the war had been an event that took place elsewhere, never truly reaching into the fabric of daily life for the people of this land. To the Japanese women, whose families back home endured hunger and loss, the sight was both heartbreaking and enlightening. Here was proof that America's power extended far beyond its battlefield victories. It lay in its ability to shield its people from the devastation that had consumed the rest of the world. The women carried these realizations quietly, their reflections rarely voiced aloud, but written into the expressions on their faces. They had arrived expecting barbarism, but instead discovered a kind of advancement that was almost unbearable to witness. To see the enemy not as savage, but as modern, disciplined, and prosperous, was more disorienting than cruelty would have been. It forced them to re-examine everything they had believed, everything they had been told, and everything they had fought for. The illusion of superiority, instilled by their homeland's propaganda, had shattered completely. What replaced it was a sobering recognition. Japan had not only lost the war of weapons, but also the war of modernity. Their captors had machines, systems, and resources that stretched beyond imagination. Even in captivity, even in defeat, the Japanese women were surrounded by the undeniable evidence of America's strength. It was a revelation that would linger with them, haunting their memories long after the gates of the camp had closed behind them.